Sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is pick up a mop that was never supposed to be theirs. The last customer of the night slammed an empty tray onto the counter with an irritated sigh before pointing toward a puddle of spilled soda spreading across the polished floor. Nobody argued. Nobody apologized. The old diner near docking gate 12 had survived too many years serving exhausted freighter crews, mechanics, cargo pilots, and travelers to waste energy on difficult customers. Neon lights buzzed softly above worn booths. A coffee machine hissed in the background. Outside the wide front windows, rain drifted across the station promenade like silver threads beneath rows of blue security lights. The glowing sign hanging over the entrance flickered between open and closed as midnight crept closer. Ethan Walker wiped his hands on a faded kitchen towel and glanced toward the dining room. The woman already pushing a mop across the wet floor never complained. She simply nodded once, picked up a stack of abandoned trays, and continued working as if the customer's careless mess had always been part of her evening. Lyra had worked at Harbor Lights Diner for almost 4 months, yet hardly anyone knew anything about her. She arrived before sunset. She left after everyone else. She spoke politely, smiled rarely, and somehow managed to make every table look spotless no matter how chaotic dinner rush became. Some employees joked that she must secretly be a cleaning robot wearing an alien face. Others barely noticed her at all. Ethan noticed. He noticed the careful way she aligned every chair before sweeping beneath it. He noticed she always carried heavier trays without asking for help. He noticed she quietly folded forgotten jackets before placing them into the lost and found cabinet instead of tossing them aside. Most of all, he noticed that nobody ever thanked her. The customer shoved his chair backward and disappeared into the rainy night without looking back. The automatic door slid shut behind him with a tired mechanical hiss. Silence settled over the diner except for the soft squeak of the mop gliding across the floor. "People sure know how to leave a place," muttered Carlos, the cook, as he switched off the grill. "At least they paid," answered another server while stacking glasses. Within minutes the staff began clocking out one by one. Chairs were flipped upside down onto empty tables. Music faded from the ceiling speakers. Registers clicked shut. Ethan signed his timesheet, slipped his jacket over one shoulder, and reached the front door before stopping. Through the reflection in the rain-speckled glass, he saw Lyra alone beneath the warm amber lights, slowly pushing the mop across nearly 2,000 square feet of tile. She moved carefully around every table as though the floor deserved respect even after everyone else had gone home. There was something strangely lonely about the rhythm. Push, pull, rinse, repeat. No audience. No applause. Just another invisible job that had to be finished before dawn. Ethan looked at the exit, then back at the empty bucket sitting beside the supply closet. Without saying a word, he turned around, walked to the storage shelf, lifted the second mop, filled another bucket with clean water, and rolled it across the quiet dining room. Lyra looked up, clearly surprised to see him still there. "Your shift ended 10 minutes ago," she said softly. Ethan dipped the mop into the bucket, wrung it out, and stepped beside her. "Yeah," he replied with an easy shrug. But the floor didn't. For the first time since anyone at Harbor Lights could remember, the sound of 2 mops echoed together across the silent diner after closing time. The next evening arrived with the familiar smell of fresh coffee, grilled sandwiches, and rain drifting through the station whenever the front doors opened. Harbor Lights Diner filled quickly as cargo crews finished their shifts and travelers searched for one last hot meal before boarding overnight transports. The conversations blended into a constant murmur beneath the low hum of ventilation fans and the occasional announcement echoing across docking gate 12. Ethan Walker moved between tables carrying plates with practiced efficiency. He was not the fastest server in the diner, nor the most talkative, but customers appreciated that he remembered names, favorite drinks, and when someone simply wanted a quiet meal after a long day. Across the room, Lyra balanced a heavy tray with effortless precision, weaving through crowded aisles without spilling a single glass. She thanked every customer with the same calm smile, whether they returned the kindness or barely acknowledged her existence. Ethan noticed something else that evening. She never sat down. During breaks, while the others gathered near the kitchen to joke over leftover fries or refill their coffee cups, Lyra quietly disappeared into the storage room to organize supplies or polish silverware that already looked clean enough to reflect the ceiling lights. It was as though staying busy felt safer than resting. Around 8:30, Carlos leaned against the grill and shook his head with a grin. "I swear she cleans things that do not even need cleaning." Another waitress laughed while stacking dessert plates. "Maybe she just likes working." Ethan glanced toward the dining room, where Lyra was carefully straightening a row of condiment bottles, so every label faced exactly the same direction. "Or maybe nobody ever told her she could take a break," he answered. Nobody responded. The conversation drifted somewhere else, but the thought remained with him. A little before closing, a delivery driver arrived with fresh produce. The young man struggled to pull a heavy cart through the entrance because one of its wheels had jammed. Before anyone could ask for help, Lyra quietly stepped outside into the cool evening air, steadied the cart, and helped guide it over the metal threshold. She smiled, accepted the driver's grateful nod, and immediately returned to wiping fingerprints from the front windows as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan watched the entire exchange without saying a word. There was a quiet consistency about her that fascinated him. She never looked around to see who noticed. She never expected praise. She simply saw work that needed doing and did it. By 11 o'clock, the final customers filtered into the rainy station corridor. Chairs once again found their places upside down on tabletops. The coffee machine released one last tired hiss before Carlos shut it down for the night. Ethan removed his apron and hung it on the same hook he used every evening. Lyra filled the mop bucket with warm water while soft reflections from the neon signs shimmered across the wet floor. She looked up just as Ethan opened the storage closet. Without speaking, he reached for the second mop again. This time she smiled before he even crossed the room. "You really do not have to stay," she said gently. Ethan rolled the bucket beside hers and shrugged with an easy grin. "Maybe not," he replied. "But work goes faster when nobody has to finish it alone." For a brief moment, the station outside seemed impossibly distant. The rain continued tapping against the windows. The lights glowed softly across the empty booths, and two ordinary workers began cleaning another ordinary floor, neither of them realizing that the smallest routines sometimes become the moments people remember for the rest of their lives. The routine continued for nearly 2 weeks before Ethan realized there was one habit Lyra never broke. Every night, exactly 12 minutes after the diner closed, she stepped outside through the back service door, carrying nothing except a small metal mug of tea. She never wandered far. She simply stood beside the narrow employee walkway overlooking the docking lanes and looked upward through the station's enormous transparent dome. Beyond the reinforced glass, hundreds of stars shimmered between the steady traffic of cargo ships arriving and departing from distant worlds. She remained there for exactly 5 minutes before returning inside to finish cleaning, as though answering a silent appointment that only she understood. Ethan noticed because he had developed the habit of taking the trash out while she was gone. The first few evenings he assumed she simply enjoyed fresh air after hours of standing inside a busy restaurant. By the 6th night, curiosity quietly replaced assumption. She always looked toward the same patch of sky. She never checked a communicator. She never spoke. She simply watched. One rainy Thursday, the station lights dimmed briefly as a massive freighter disconnected from the docking ring. Blue engine light washed across the service corridor, reflecting softly against the silver strands of Lyra's hair. Ethan wheeled a trash container outside and stopped a respectful distance away. Neither of them spoke immediately. The low rumble of departing engines filled the silence between them. Finally, Ethan looked upward. "Waiting for someone?" he asked. Lyra kept her eyes on the stars for another few seconds before answering. "Not exactly." Her voice remained gentle, almost thoughtful. "Then what are you watching?" She smiled faintly without turning toward him. "The departures." Ethan leaned one shoulder against the metal railing. "You like watching ships leave?" "I like wondering where they are going." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough. I used to do the same when I worked on cargo vessels." That caught her attention. She turned toward him with quiet surprise. "You travel?" "For almost 9 years." He smiled at the memory. "Mostly repair jobs. Engine failures. Navigation systems. Long days and longer nights." Lyra lowered her eyes to the steaming mug in her hands. "Did you ever find the place you wanted to stay?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Honestly, I stopped looking. Then I found this diner." She looked genuinely puzzled. "A restaurant. The people." He glanced through the kitchen window where Carlos was pretending to sing while scrubbing the grill. Another waitress laughed so hard she nearly dropped a stack of clean plates. Turns out home has a lot less to do with buildings than I thought. Lyra followed his gaze, but said nothing. The corners of her mouth lifted just enough to reveal the beginning of a smile before it quietly disappeared again. An announcement echoed through the station, listing arrivals from 3 neighboring systems. Lyra instinctively looked toward the stars once more. Ethan noticed the movement. "Still waiting?" he asked gently. She hesitated for several seconds. "Perhaps. For family." Another pause. This one lasted longer. "For the day I stopped looking over my shoulder." The answer was calm, yet something inside it carried a weight Ethan could not explain. Before he could ask another question, she finished the last sip of tea and headed back toward the service entrance. At the doorway, she stopped and looked back at him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Ethan asked. Lyra rested one hand on the door handle as warm light spilled across the hallway behind her. "For asking questions without demanding answers." Then she disappeared inside. Ethan remained beneath the station dome for another minute, watching a distant line of lights vanish into the darkness beyond the stars, unable to shake the feeling that the quiet woman who spent every night cleaning tables carried a story far larger than the small diner could ever contain. By the time another week passed, Harbor Lights Diner had quietly settled into a rhythm that almost nobody noticed except the 2 people who stayed after everyone else had gone home. The dinner rush came and went with its usual orchestra of clattering plates, steaming coffee, laughter, and tired conversations from travelers chasing the next departure. Neon reflections stretched across the polished windows while freight shuttles drifted beyond the station dome like slow-moving constellations. Closing time arrived with familiar precision. Carlos switched off the grill. The registers counted their final receipts. Chairs rose onto tables one after another until the dining room stood empty beneath rows of warm amber lights. Ethan hung his apron beside the kitchen door, walked to the supply closet, and reached for the second mop without even thinking about it. He no longer needed to ask. Lyra looked over from the sink, where she was filling a bucket with warm water. A small smile crossed her face before she handed him the extra bottle of floor cleaner. "You remembered," she said quietly. Ethan smiled back. "I figured if we were going to keep doing this, we might as well become efficient." A soft laugh escaped her, so brief that it almost disappeared beneath the sound of running water. It surprised both of them. They wheeled their buckets into the dining room and began from opposite ends, their movements naturally finding the same pace. Neither one tried to lead. Neither one hurried. The only sounds were the gentle sweep of damp mops across the floor, the distant hum of air recyclers, and rain tapping softly against the front windows. After several quiet minutes, Ethan noticed Lyra had begun humming a melody so softly that he almost mistook it for the ventilation system. The tune was unfamiliar, graceful, and strangely peaceful. "I have never heard that song before," he said. She looked slightly embarrassed, as though she had forgotten anyone else could hear her. "It is very old. From your home." She nodded once. "My mother used to sing it whenever it rained." Ethan dipped his mop into the bucket again before speaking. "It sounds like the kind of song that makes people slow down." "That is what she wanted," Lyra replied. She believed people listened better when they stopped rushing. Ethan considered the words while watching the clean water ripple inside the bucket. "She sounds wise." Lyra looked toward the rain beyond the glass. She was. Silence settled between them again, but it no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt shared. When they reached the center of the dining room, their paths met naturally. Ethan stepped aside to give her room, but she simply adjusted her direction so they continued working side by side. For several minutes, they cleaned the same stretch of floor without speaking another word. Somehow the quiet carried more meaning than conversation ever could. Near the front entrance, Ethan noticed an elderly customer had accidentally left behind a knitted blue scarf hanging over the back of a booth. Before he could pick it up, Lyra gently folded it with careful hands, smoothing every crease before placing it inside a clear storage bag with a handwritten note that read, "Found after closing." Ethan smiled. "You always treat forgotten things like somebody is coming back for them." She paused for only a moment before answering. "Most people do." The simple reply lingered in the air long after the words were spoken. Ethan looked around the empty diner, the neatly aligned chairs, the polished windows reflecting soft golden light, and the freshly cleaned floor stretching toward the silent entrance. He realized that Lyra approached every ordinary task as though it mattered because someone, somewhere, might one day return and notice that kindness had been waiting for them all along. The days slipped quietly into one another until the people working at Harbor Lights Diner stopped asking why Ethan was always the last employee to leave. They simply accepted that the lights in the dining room stayed on a little longer every night, and that someone always remembered to lock the front door after the floor had dried. Outside, autumn storms rolled across the station more often, painting the transparent dome with ribbons of rain that caught the glow of passing spacecraft. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee, fresh bread, and lemon floor cleaner blended into something that somehow felt comforting after midnight. One evening, Carlos discovered 3 slices of apple pie that had not been sold before closing. "Take them home or throw them away," he called while pulling on his jacket. "I'm not eating another bite tonight." The kitchen emptied within minutes, leaving Ethan and Lyra standing alone beneath the warm lights. Ethan carried the small plate to one of the corner booths instead of the trash bin. "Seems like a shame to waste good pie," he said. Lyra hesitated before sitting across from him. For several seconds, neither reached for a fork. The silence felt familiar now, almost welcome. Finally, Ethan smiled. "You know, I have worked with people for years, and somehow I still know almost nothing about you." Lyra lowered her eyes toward the pie. "Perhaps that makes me mysterious. Or careful." She looked up, meeting his eyes with quiet surprise. "Maybe both," she admitted. Ethan nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. He never pressed further. Instead, he took a small bite and made an exaggerated expression of disappointment. Definitely not Carlos's best work. Lyra laughed before she could stop herself. The sound filled the empty diner with unexpected warmth. "You are lying," she said. "It is actually very good." Ethan grinned. "I know. I just wanted to see if you would disagree with me." She shook her head, still smiling. "You humans ask strange questions." Occupational hazard. They finished the pie slowly while watching maintenance vehicles glide across the docking lanes beyond the windows. A cargo shuttle lifted into the darkness, its engines casting waves of pale blue light across the ceiling. Lyra watched until the ship disappeared among the stars. "Do you ever regret leaving the cargo fleet?" she asked. Ethan leaned back against the booth. "Sometimes I miss the traveling." He thought for a moment before continuing. "But I do not miss always feeling like I was passing through someone else's life." She considered that quietly. "And now I know where I will be tomorrow morning." He smiled. "Turns out certainty is underrated." Lyra wrapped both hands around her cup of tea, letting the warmth settle into her fingers. "Where I come from, certainty usually belongs to people with power." Ethan gently shook his head. "Not where I come from. Sometimes it belongs to people who know the coffee machine will break every Tuesday." Another laugh escaped her, softer this time. The station announcement system echoed faintly overhead, announcing arrivals from distant sectors that neither of them had ever visited. Lyra listened until the voice faded into the background. "You make ordinary things sound important," she said quietly. Ethan looked around the empty diner with its stacked chairs, polished windows, and spotless floor reflecting the golden lights overhead. "Maybe they already are," he replied. "Most of life happens in ordinary moments. We just forget to notice." Lyra remained silent for several seconds before reaching into the pocket of her work apron. She placed a small folded paper crane on the table between them. It had been made from the wrapper of a disposable sugar packet. "My mother taught me how to fold these," she said softly. She used to leave one wherever she felt safe. Ethan carefully picked it up, studying every precise crease without unfolding it. "Then I guess this little diner is doing something right." Lyra looked around the quiet room one more time. For the first time since Ethan had met her, the guarded expression she carried so carefully every day seemed just a little lighter, as though the empty restaurant had become more than a workplace. It had quietly become the first place in a very long time where she no longer felt completely alone. The following evening began like every other shift, but small changes often arrived wearing ordinary faces. A steady stream of travelers filled the booths while soft jazz drifted through the speakers above the counter. Outside, the station glowed beneath a pale blue sky shield that filtered the endless stars into a gentle haze. Ethan carried fresh coffee to a group of mechanics discussing engine repairs while Lyra quietly refilled water glasses before anyone needed to ask. They moved through the crowded diner with the comfortable rhythm they had built over weeks of working side by side. Near the end of the dinner rush, the floor manager, Mr. Harlan, walked out from the office holding a clipboard beneath one arm. He was known for caring more about schedules than people, but he rarely raised his voice. He simply expected everything to be finished before closing. His eyes swept across the dining room before settling on Lyra, who was wiping fingerprints from a window that most people would never have noticed. "You missed table 14, he said flatly. Lyra immediately walked over, although the table had already been cleaned minutes earlier. She inspected it carefully anyway and quietly polished a spot near the edge that reflected the overhead lights. Mr. Harlan frowned. "You spend too much time making everything perfect. Customers do not pay for perfection. They pay for speed." Lyra lowered her head slightly. "I understand." Ethan had been carrying a tray of clean dishes toward the kitchen when he overheard the conversation. He looked at the table, then at the spotless floor surrounding it. Nothing about the criticism seemed fair. Before he could stop himself, he set the tray down on the counter. "She finishes more work than anybody here," he said calmly. The manager turned toward him. "Nobody asked your opinion, Ethan." Ethan nodded politely. "That is true." His voice never changed. "But I have worked enough jobs to recognize someone who takes pride in what they do." The kitchen became unusually quiet. Even Carlos paused with a towel in his hand. Mr. Harlan glanced back toward Lyra. "She is here to clean tables, not polish a museum." Ethan smiled gently instead of arguing. "Maybe that is why the place looks so good every morning." The manager studied him for a long second before exhaling through his nose. "Just finish your shifts on time." Without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the office. Conversation slowly returned to normal. Plates clattered. The coffee machine hissed. Customers continued eating as though nothing unusual had happened. Lyra remained standing beside table 14, still holding the cleaning cloth in both hands. Ethan walked over and picked up the empty coffee cup resting on the booth. "Looks clean to me," he said quietly. She looked at him with an expression he had never seen before. It was not surprise. It was confusion, as though she could not understand why someone would speak on her behalf without expecting anything in return. "You should not have done that," she whispered. Ethan shrugged while placing the cup onto his tray. "Why not? It could make your work more difficult." He thought about the question for only a moment. Doing the right thing sometimes does. Lyra stared at the polished tabletop where the light reflected like still water. After several silent seconds, she asked the question that had quietly followed them for weeks. "Why do you keep helping me?" Ethan rested one hand against the back of the booth and answered without hesitation. "Because every night I watch you take care of a place that most people stop seeing after dinner. Because you notice what everyone else ignores. And because you always look tired before you ever look angry." The words settled gently between them. Lyra blinked once and looked away toward the rain beginning to gather beyond the windows. Her voice was almost too soft to hear when she finally answered. "No one has ever described me that way before." Ethan smiled with the same quiet warmth he carried every evening. "Maybe they were looking at your job." He picked up the tray again. "I was looking at you." For the rest of the night, neither of them spoke very much. Yet something invisible had shifted between them. Trust did not arrive with grand promises or dramatic moments. Sometimes it arrived in the simple realization that someone had seen your burden long before they ever asked your name. The storm arrived without warning just before the dinner rush ended. Rain hammered against the station dome so heavily that the stars disappeared behind sheets of silver water. Every few seconds, the glow from arriving spacecraft flashed across the ceiling, bathing Harbor Lights Diner in waves of pale blue light before fading back into warm amber. Customers lingered longer than usual, waiting for weather advisories to clear. Coffee cups stayed full. Conversations grew softer. Even the station announcements sounded distant beneath the steady rhythm of rain. Then everything changed. A deep vibration rolled through the floor beneath Ethan's boots. It was different from the familiar arrival of cargo freighters. This vibration carried perfect rhythm, smooth and controlled, as though several enormous engines had synchronized into a single heartbeat. Every glass on the counter trembled almost imperceptibly. Carlos looked toward the front windows. "That is not a freight convoy," he murmured. Outside, lights appeared beyond the rain. One after another they descended through the clouds in flawless formation. Sleek silver vessels glided toward the diplomatic landing platforms instead of the commercial docks. Within seconds, the station information screens interrupted their advertisements. Welcome, official delegation. Priority access in effect. Please follow security instructions. Customers stopped talking. Travelers stood from their booths and moved toward the windows. Even Mr. Harlan stepped out of his office, adjusting his tie while staring at the growing procession outside. Ethan instinctively glanced across the dining room. Lyra had frozen beside the coffee station. Her hands remained wrapped around a stack of clean plates, but her eyes never left the lights beyond the glass. The color slowly drained from her face. Ethan walked closer, lowering his voice. You know who they are. She did not answer immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Another vibration echoed through the station as more ships settled onto the landing platforms. Through the rain, they could now see long lines of dark vehicles moving across the illuminated transit bridge toward the commercial district. Uniformed escorts surrounded them with perfect precision. Nobody inside the diner recognized the insignias, but everyone understood one thing. Someone extraordinarily important had arrived. Lyra quietly set the plates onto the counter with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. I hoped they would not find me here, she whispered almost to herself. Ethan heard every word. Find you. She finally looked at him. There was no panic in her expression, only the tired resignation of someone who had known this day would eventually come. Some journeys always reach their destination, she said softly. Before Ethan could respond, the automatic entrance door slid open. Cold air swept across the dining room, carrying the scent of rain and polished metal. 6 figures entered wearing elegant navy uniforms trimmed with silver thread. None carried visible weapons. None raised their voices. Yet the entire restaurant instinctively stepped aside as they walked across the freshly cleaned floor with measured, respectful precision. Their leader was an older woman with silver hair gathered neatly behind her shoulders and deep blue skin that shimmered beneath the overhead lights. She paused only once, scanning the room with calm certainty before her eyes settled on Lyra. Time seemed to stop. The woman placed one hand gently over her heart and bowed her head with unmistakable respect. Every member of the delegation immediately mirrored the gesture. The customers watched in stunned silence. Carlos slowly lowered the coffee pot still in his hand. Mr. Harlan stared without blinking. Ethan turned toward Lyra just as she quietly closed her eyes for a single breath. When she opened them again, the quiet waitress who had spent months cleaning tables stood with the same calm dignity as the delegation before her. The older woman finally spoke, her voice warm enough to carry across the silent diner without effort. Your Highness, she said, the House of Valor has been searching for you. It is time to come home. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The rain continued whispering against the station dome, while every pair of eyes inside Harbor Lights Diner remained fixed on Lyra. Mr. Harlan instinctively straightened his jacket. Carlos quietly set the coffee pot back onto its warmer. Customers who had spent the last hour complaining about delayed departures now stood speechless beside their booths. The older woman from the delegation took one respectful step forward but stopped before reaching Lyra, as though crossing the remaining distance required permission rather than authority. Your Highness, she repeated gently, the council has been waiting for your decision. Your absence has lasted longer than anyone expected. Lyra lowered her eyes for only a moment before looking around the diner. She did not look at the delegation first. She looked at the freshly polished windows, the neatly aligned chairs, the coffee cups waiting to be washed, the floor that still reflected the warm amber lights overhead. Then her gaze settled on the mop bucket standing quietly beside Ethan. It was still half full. The silence stretched until Mr. Harlan suddenly stepped forward, his face pale with embarrassment. Your Highness, I had no idea. His voice no longer carried the confidence of a manager correcting an employee. If I ever spoke to you without proper respect, I sincerely apologize. One by one, the others echoed similar words. A customer removed his cap. Another lowered his head. Even people who had never spoken more than a few sentences to Lyra suddenly treated her as though she had become someone entirely different. Ethan watched the room transform in front of him. Only hours earlier, everyone had seen a quiet waitress carrying heavy trays, and wiping fingerprints from tables. Now they saw a princess. Yet the person standing beside the coffee station had not changed at all. Only everyone else's perception had. Lyra thanked each apology with quiet grace, but something about the moment made her shoulders seem heavier rather than lighter. Ethan looked down at the damp floor between them. One narrow section beside the entrance still waited to be cleaned before the job was finished. Without saying anything, he reached for the second mop leaning against the wall. He dipped it into the bucket, wrung out the excess water, and walked toward the unfinished corner. The soft squeak of the mop echoed through the completely silent diner. Every member of the delegation turned toward him. Mr. Harlan blinked in disbelief. Ethan looked over his shoulder with the same relaxed expression he wore every evening after closing. "There is still one spot left," he said simply. "It will dry better if we finish before everyone starts walking through it." Lyra stared at him for a heartbeat, then another. Slowly, the guarded expression she had carried for months melted into something warmer than relief. She stepped beside him, picked up her own mop, and began cleaning the final stretch of floor exactly as she had done every night before. The older woman from the delegation smiled quietly without interrupting. None of the uniformed officials moved. None attempted to hurry the moment. They simply watched as the future ruler of one of the most respected houses in the sector stood shoulder to shoulder with an ordinary human employee, finishing an ordinary task. When the last reflection of water disappeared beneath the warm lights, Lyra rested both hands on the mop handle and looked toward Ethan. "You knew," she said softly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "That everything had changed." He shook his head with an easy smile. "No." He glanced around the spotless diner before looking back at her. The floor still needed cleaning. That part stayed exactly the same. For the first time since the delegation had arrived, Lyra laughed without restraint. The sound filled the empty restaurant with genuine joy, and even the officials found themselves smiling. In that quiet little diner beside docking gate 12, surrounded by polished tables and the fading scent of fresh coffee, a crown had earned respect from the room, but a simple mop had reminded a princess what dignity truly felt like. Several months later, the first snow of the season drifted gently across docking gate 12, softening the steel edges of the station beneath a blanket of white illuminated by thousands of tiny navigation lights. Harbor Lights Diner looked exactly the same as it always had. The neon sign still flickered during cold mornings. The coffee machine still hissed before sunrise. Carlos still insisted that nobody appreciated his apple pie enough. Travelers continued arriving with tired eyes and heavy bags, searching for warmth before their next journey. Life had a remarkable way of continuing even after extraordinary days. Ethan Walker still worked the evening shift. He still remembered regular customers by name. He still stayed after closing to help stack chairs before heading home. Sometimes people asked whether he regretted turning down the invitation that had arrived from the House of Valor a week after the delegation had departed. The elegant envelope, sealed with silver wax and delivered by diplomatic courier, had offered him a prestigious position within the royal household. Ethan had smiled, thanked the messenger, and politely declined. He had written only one sentence in his reply. "Someone still has to make sure the coffee is hot." The letter became something of a legend among the palace staff, though Ethan never intended it that way. One crisp evening, nearly 6 months after Lyra had left the station, several sleek diplomatic shuttles appeared outside the diner just before closing. Their polished hulls reflected the golden lights of the restaurant as uniformed attendants quietly formed a respectful path toward the entrance. Customers immediately reached for their communicators, whispering excitedly as security personnel stepped aside with practiced precision. Yet when the front doors opened, the woman who entered wore a simple blue coat instead of ceremonial robes. No jeweled crown rested upon her silver hair. No medals decorated her clothing. Lyra smiled at Carlos first, thanked him for remembering the extra cinnamon in the apple pie, waved to the surprised regular customers, and finally looked toward Ethan, who was drying coffee mugs behind the counter exactly as he always did. "You are late," Ethan said with an amused smile. Lyra laughed softly. Diplomatic meetings always run longer than people expect. "Coffee, please." He poured her favorite blend into the familiar ceramic mug she used to carry after closing. Neither of them mentioned titles. Neither of them spoke about treaties, councils, or royal responsibilities. Instead, they talked about the weather, The new dessert Carlos had nearly burned the week before, and the cargo pilot who still tipped everyone with homemade cookies every Friday. When the last customer left and the lights dimmed for closing, Ethan automatically walked toward the supply closet. He opened the door and paused. Two mops still leaned against the wall exactly where they always had. He reached for one without thinking. Before he could grab the second, another hand gently lifted it from the rack. Lyra stood beside him, smiling with the same quiet warmth she had carried during those late nights months before. Together they filled the buckets, rolled them into the empty dining room, and began cleaning the floor beneath the amber lights while rain tapped softly against the windows once again. Outside, diplomats, security officers, and official vehicles waited with endless patience. None of them interrupted. Through the glass, they watched their future queen moving a mop beside an ordinary human as though there were no more important place in the galaxy to be. When the floor finally dried, Lyra carefully placed her mop back into the closet before turning toward the windows where the first stars had begun appearing beyond the clearing sky. "Do you know what changed my life?" she asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. She smiled toward the spotless floor stretching across the silent diner. "Not the day they found me." Her violet eyes reflected both the stars above and the warm lights below. "The day someone saw a tired coworker before he ever saw a princess." Ethan never found a clever answer. He simply switched off the last light beside the entrance and held the door open as they stepped into the quiet night together. Behind them, the polished floor reflected the empty chairs, the sleeping diner, and the faint glow of distant constellations. In a galaxy that admired crowns, one ordinary act of kindness had quietly become the brightest thing in the room.